every once in a while, as a parent, I need to do my unusual task of disciplining children. It's not that unusual, unfortunately, but it's supposed to be. And that's what God calls his task of judgment at times upon us. But I every now and again, I need to participate in my unusual task of giving a child a timeout. And here's the thing. Sometimes I've been known to forget that I have a child in timeout because things suddenly get quiet. Any parent ever been there before? You put a kid in timeout, you're like, things are quiet. Things are restful, things are peaceful, and I'm going to read something or whatever, and then you're like, oh yeah, there's a kid in timeout. That happens to me occasionally. It happened to me yesterday, true confession. And I also have this policy. Really, I need to change this because I have a policy of no noise making when you're in timeout. If you want to get out of timeout and you're making noise, you're doing the wrong thing. So it turns into a vicious cycle. Forgetfulness and extension of timeout. So that's a problem. We're going to address that. I have it on the list of things to do next family meeting. But every now and again, I don't know if you've ever been there, but I forget that I have a kid in timeout, and they end up being there a little longer than I had initially intended. I think that as we walk with the Lord, there are times where we feel like he has forgotten us. Where we feel like we're in a timeout and he has gotten distracted. He's doing something different. He's forgotten us there. And I think that's how Joseph must have felt. Where we last saw him, he'd been sold off to slavery. If you've been here in the last couple weeks, his brothers were jealous. They sold him off into slavery. He was betrayed by his brothers. He found himself in a foreign land. And he was elevated in his master's home, but then he was falsely accused and thrown in prison. So that's where we left Joseph. He's been thrown in prison. He's in a dungeon, and he's got to be starting to feel like he's been forgotten. The very first words of Genesis chapter 40 say sometime later. We're not sure how long exactly, but it's a length of time. Joseph spends some time in prison. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. So he's in prison, and he's not, just like he was elevated as in his master's household, he's been elevated within the prison. He's still a prisoner, but he's been given some forms of authority. He's leading certain areas of the prison. He's even having other prisoners be put under his care in this point in his life. And yet, he's got to be feeling like he's been forgotten by God, that he has been abandoned, that he is sort of off on his own and not sure what's going to happen next. Here's the big idea of the sermon this morning. This is a big thought that we're going to return to. God is working while we are waiting. God is working while we are waiting. So Joseph he's hidden away in prison. He's in the dungeon. He's gone from dreaming to dungeon. He's gone from these dreams of his family coming and bowing before him to feeling like maybe God's not going to bring that to fruition. Maybe I'm not going to be serving a great purpose in my generation. He's got to be questioning at times, and yet he stays faithful in the midst of it. But God is working while we are waiting. When we feel like God has forgotten us, we serve the same God who Joseph served. I think sometimes we forget that. We read these stories in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament. We see God do great things. We see his faithfulness over time. And we have to remind ourselves that we are serving the same God that these people in the Bible were serving as well. And that God is always at work, oftentimes behind the scenes. If you're living the life of Joseph, you're questioning where that's happening right now. Even though you're elevated within the prison, you're like, I'm still in prison. I went from being the favorite child, most likely the heir of my father's household, to now being in a dungeon in a foreign land. How does this happen? It seems to keep getting worse and worse for Joseph. But God is always working. He's working while we are waiting. And he's working in a lot of different ways. One of the ways that he's working, even while we're waiting, sometimes we don't recognize this very clearly, but it's happening. God uses us while we wait. God uses us while we wait. We see this in Joseph's life. Let's pick it up in the middle of verse 4. After they had been in custody, this is the baker and the cupbearer. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, each had a dream the same night. And each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came in the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So they wake up and they've had these kind of, strange dreams, I think, to say the least. The cupbearer's dream is about these 3 branches that sprout grapes, and he ends up grabbing the grapes and he squeezes them into Pharaoh's cup and then puts the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And, the tree grows magically. You know how your dreams, things just happen. All of a sudden you appear. That's kind of the feeling I get with this dream. He's standing there, there's a tree, there's some branches, all of a sudden grapes just sprout right out of it. And all of a sudden he's like, "Whoa, I've got Pharaoh's cup in my hand." And then he's squeezing it, and then he's like, "I was out in the field a second ago, but now I'm standing before Pharaoh and I'm putting it in his hand." He's confused. It's a strange dream, but he can sense that there's something more than just an odd dream, that there's some meaning to it. And so that's the cupbearer's dream. The other dream was not so good. I'm going to leave you to read that dream if you want the details of it. It's not so good, but it ultimately ends with that person's demise. The baker is not going to make it through this whole thing. He's going to end up being executed by Pharaoh. And Joseph hears these dreams. Neither of them know if they're good or bad. Neither of them have any idea what the meaning is. But Joseph said, "God knows the interpretation. The interpretations belong to God. So tell them to me." And I love that, because even though Joseph's got to be in this period of questioning and doubting and waiting and wondering what's going on, he's also leaning in his relationship with God. You can see that because he feels that he has the connection with God to be able to interpret this dream through the power of God in the midst of all of this. And so he's confident enough to say, "Tell me the dreams, because I've got this line to God, and he's going to answer what the interpretation is of each of these dreams." God can use us while we wait. So the interesting thing is, really in the lives of these people, Joseph is showing up in a different and interesting way. One of them in a good way, one of them is getting a hard truth. But it's still true, and God is using him, and God is working through him, and even speaking to him during this season. I think we can see times in our lives where we've got an ultimate goal, where God is taking us here. I sense that God wants me to be doing this or doing that. I sense that I need to make a difference in my workplace, or I sense that I need to change careers and go over here, and God's going to accomplish something through me. And yet, in the midst of that waiting season for where you think God's going to eventually lead me, where I sense that he's guiding me, even in the midst of that waiting time, he can still use you in those times as well. I can remember being in college. I went to Michigan State, but I knew I wanted to go into ministry even before I went there. Why would you go to Michigan State if you want to go into ministry? They don't have a great, theology program, as far as we all know, and that's true. They don't. But what I did when I went there was I took some advice and got involved in ministry on campus and learned ministry while doing ministry. That was the advice of one of my mentors, who said, "Yeah, go to a public school and learn the heartbeat of people who don't know God, and learn what they need in terms of coming into relationship with him, and do ministry and learn ministry by doing it in the lives of people." And so I was excited to be in ministry. That was where my vision was. That was where I felt God was taking me in full-time vocational ministry, whatever that means, because we're all called to be ministers of the gospel wherever God has placed us. And in that waiting period of getting to the point, okay, finishing up my undergrad and moving on towards seminary and figuring out where God's going to have me work and where he's going to have me land as a pastor in ministry, he was still using me during those times as a college student as I allowed him to do so. And those some of those times were as fruitful times of ministry as I've ever had, especially in individual person-to-person relationships. Had a chance to share the gospel often at school, and lead Bible study in the dorm, and counsel people down the hall who were going through difficult things in relationships and whatnot. God still can use us while we wait, even if we're not where we believe he's ultimately calling us to be. So again, the cupbearer's dream is all about these branches. They sprout grapes, and he's going to interpret this dream. We're going to pick it up in verse 12. "This is what the dream means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you," just like I'm seeing an opportunity here, "when all goes well with you, please remember me and show me kindness. mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. He gives a little bit of his backstory. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. So he's kind of looking out for himself a little bit, trying to find a way out of this season of waiting. And he predicts these dreams, and they both come true. The cupbearer is lifted up and restored to his position. The baker is lifted up and executed, unfortunately. And here's how this chapter ends. In verse 23, it says, the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. It's just so matter of fact. It's like, and that's how we can feel in the midst of waiting. We feel forgotten. And the interesting thing is, it's the cupbearer who forgot Joseph, but it's not God who forgot him, because God continues to be at work in Joseph's life, even in the midst of this waiting. The next verse, into chapter 41, says, when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. So 2 more years. Now, we don't know what the sum time is, but it's probably years. Now 2 more years pass, and now Pharaoh has a dream. So what's going on in the midst of all of this? God uses while we wait. He also prepares us while we wait. God prepares us while we wait. I think of all the biblical characters who had a time of waiting, who had a period of waiting on God, or a lengthy preparation time. It's all over the place. Abraham waited for Isaac. Moses tended sheep in the desert for 40 years before God called him to free the people of Israel from the land of Egypt. This would happen generations later after Joseph brings the family into Egypt. Noah waited for rain. Jesus prepared. We know a lot about 3 years of Jesus, approximately 3 years of Jesus' life and ministry. We know a lot less about the first 30. Not nothing, but a lot less about his first 30 years. Years of preparation. And that's the Son of God. He came fully God, fully man, and he had 30 years of preparation. And he prepares us while we wait. And we all know when we talk about waiting, waiting is usually a painful time. Not always, but it's usually a painful time. And for Joseph, it's certainly a painful time. And God does something in those painful times. It's not that he's punishing us, or it's not that he's even necessarily the one sending them, depending on how you look at that theologically. Of course, God is in control, but yet he allows some things to happen in our lives. And here's how C.S. Lewis put this thought. God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pains. When we go through difficult times, when we go through seasons of waiting or seasons of pain or trial, he can speak to us in a way that is more clear than at many other times in our lives. And the unfortunate thing is sometimes we push away from God when we start going through difficult times, instead of leaning in, instead of stepping closer and listening for his voice in our lives, because he can shout to us through those times, even though they're difficult. So Pharaoh had this dream. We're going to pick it up in the second half of verse 1 of chapter 41. Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile. When out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again, and he had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them 7 other heads of grain sprouted thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. He wakes up and he, much like the cupbearer and the baker, he's disturbed by this. He's like, this is weird. I can tell there's a deeper meaning to this. What's going on? I want to know what the meaning of these dreams might be. And so he calls to his magicians. He calls to all the wise men of Egypt and all the spiritual people, the people who were, had read the sacred writings, all this stuff. He's bringing them before him and trying to get an interpretation for these dreams. But they were honest with them. They're like, we have no idea. We don't know what's going on with these dreams. They're very strange. We're not sure what the meaning of these dreams might be. And it's at this time, when Pharaoh's striking out on finding someone who can interpret these dreams, it's at this point that the cupbearer goes, I remember something that I had previously forgotten 2 years ago. And so he tells Pharaoh the whole story. You were upset with me, and I was in prison, and he interpreted my dream and Baker's dream, and interpreted them both correctly. And so you might want to ask that guy. He's got this thing with dreams. And Joseph has had this thing with dreams from the very beginning of his story. And so they call for Joseph. Joseph, wisely, he's been in a dungeon for many years. He gets himself ready. He says he shaves. It notes that he actually shaves. He gets ready, and he prepares himself to stand before Pharaoh. And he gets before him. In verse 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And I love this. This is a sign of the preparation that Joseph has been through. He already gave God credit for previous dreams that he has interpreted, but not so strongly as this, and not before the king of all of the land and the one who could potentially rescue him from his current plight. Here's what he says in response. I cannot do it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Here's another thing that God does for us while we're waiting. God humbles us while we wait. With humility versus pride, really with the big difference between humility and pride, there are a lot of ways we can define it. You know, sometimes people say, like, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. I think that's good. But I think for me, ultimately, the thing that separates pride from humility, spiritually speaking, is dependence. Pride is when we're dependent on ourselves or something that we create, and we think it's our own doing. Humility is realizing that all we have comes from God and that we're dependent on Him in every circumstance and in every moment. This waiting period in Joseph's life has made him even more dependent upon God. He's humbled while he's waiting. He's humbled. So he carries on. Pharaoh tells him the dream again. We hear a repeat of what we had heard before. He hears about the dream. And in verse 25, here's what Joseph says to Pharaoh. The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. So before the other dreams, there were two different dreams. The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. There's a few things you might notice as we look at that passage. One of the things that stands out to me is the many references and mentions of God. Remember that Joseph is coming from a foreign land into Egypt, who has their gods, and Joseph comes with his backstory. But he is representing God to Pharaoh in Egypt, and he's actually really referring back to God multiple times. There are actually 6 mentions of God. He either uses God, or he uses the pronoun he, referring to God 6 times in those 7 verses. And so his humility, dependence, he's willing to tell Pharaoh about God and about God's strength and about God being the one who's interpreting these dreams, about God being the one who's sending a message to Pharaoh. And so we see this humility, but we also see just how he's been prepared during this time of waiting. The plan, so he also then delivers his plan to Pharaoh. He tells Pharaoh, here's what we should do. You should find someone who's wise and who's able to lead and all this stuff. And they're going to gather the excess during those times of plenty and be disciplined about holding on to the plenty in those times. Because we know human nature is whatever you have, you use. And it's really, that's why saving is so difficult. That's why most Americans spend more in a year than they bring in terms of their income. Because it's very difficult to save and to have the discipline to do that. And at the same time, it's what's in our best interest to kind of save, especially in times of plenty, for times of want in the future. So he's applying some wisdom. He's saying, find a wise person who can do this, who can really lead the nation in gathering the excess And then in the times of want, we'll have enough in this land, whereas people all around the world who are also affected by this famine in this area will not have all they need, and we can provide for ourselves and sell to others. And so he kind of gives this plan, and it says in verse 37, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. And so Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? So Pharaoh, here's the plan. Joseph doesn't mention himself about the plan at all. We don't know if maybe he's thinking in the back of his head that could happen. We don't know. But we know he's being humble. We know he's putting God at the forefront. And we know he's laying out a wise plan. And Pharaoh recognizes the Spirit of God in Joseph. This foreign Pharaoh who knows nothing of the Hebrew God recognizes the Spirit of God in Joseph. So we see how he's been prepared, how he's been humbled, and even how throughout the course of this process, another thing that God does while we wait is that he's been refined while he was waiting. God refines us while we wait. He prepares us, he softens our sharp edges, he shines us up, he refines us while we wait. He gives us a purity while we wait. There's so much work that he does in us during the waiting periods. My nephew and his family have a rock tumbler. Okay, if a rock tumbler is something where you can find a cool looking rock and you can put it inside this canister and it will like spin and vibrate and all this stuff over the course of a whole bunch of time, and it will take that rock that might have some jagged edges, might be kind of rough looking, and it will turn it into something completely different. So you can see here there's a couple of Petoskey, or that's one Petoskey stone actually, in a before and after photo. You know how like when you find a Petoskey stone, like if you're looking for them, you have to get them wet to even tell a lot of times if there's a pattern on the stone. And so when they're dried out and whatnot, they look like what's on the left. But after you put them in the tumbler, they'll come out eventually looking like on the right. After you smooth them out and then polish them, they'll come out looking like what's on the right. And that's what God does with us. He refines us. He brings out the beauty in our lives. He works with us. But sometimes this takes longer than we want it to. Really, all the time, it seems like it takes longer than we want it to. I went ahead and read the instruction manual for the rock tumbler, and I was kind of interested by, just by how long this process really takes. It's basically, it's almost a toy, this thing. But at the same time, it's a process that really has a result at the end. So there are 4 different stages and levels of grit that you use to mix the rock in. So what you do is you take the canister, you put the rocks in, you add a little bit of water, and you dump this package of grit in there. It's like a sand. And then you let the machine do its work. The first level, grit number 1, you put the rock in there with the grit and the water for 3 to 5 days. 3 to 5 days. And then it just does its thing that whole entire time. And when you pull it out, the stones should have lost all their sharp edges. It should start to feel really smooth. Then you put grit number 2. It goes for 6 to 8 days. And then grit number 3, 6 to 8 days again. And then grit number 4, last of all, 7 to 10 days. So and it notes many times throughout the course of the instructions, the long polishing time will help you get the best results. So if you're impatient and you just kind of go with the bare minimum, it's not going to look as nice as if you take this whole stretch of time, the better part of a month, to shine up this rock. I thought that was kind of cool. And they've actually put it to the test, and it really works. This is a Petoskey stone that they found. And when they found it, they needed water to be able to tell, is this really a Petoskey stone? And now, you probably can't tell from where you're sitting, but now this thing is beautiful. And you can see all the patterns on it. And it came out just absolutely amazing because of this process, this refining process, this polishing process that it went through. Our trials and our waiting puts us into the tumbler. And it can be painful, and it can be a longer season than you expect it to be or than you want it to be. But when we come out, He's formed us more into the image of His Son, which is our ultimate goal. And so God can use these times in our lives. Job is famously the person who went through the most suffering of any other character in the Bible. And he just went through all sorts of awful things. And his heart throughout it, he was not perfect, but he never denied or cursed God. It says in Job chapter 23, verses 8 through 10, he's talking about seeking for God, wanting to ask Him some questions. If I go to the east, He's not there. If I go to the west, I do not find Him. When He's at work in the north, I do not see Him. When He turns to the south, I catch no glimpse of Him. So he's sharing that feeling that, God, where are you? If you forgot me, I'm in time out. Where are you? Verse 10 says, but he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. Be refined by this trial, by this testing period. God is working while we are waiting. I think it can be so hard to see, hard to experience at times, but God is working while we are waiting. This past week, our team had a chance to go and participate in a church conference down in Orlando, and just to hear from a lot of great speakers, to think about what God is using our church for, just to seek the Lord in that, to be spiritually refreshed, and also to come home with some ideas and whatnot for ministry and some connection time, all of those things. And we just had a chance to hear from some amazing people, and there was one story that I could not believe how well it integrated with this series. I thought, I have to share this story with you. Now, there was a 2-part video, and it's too long to show you both parts. And so I'm just going to summarize the first half of this story before we watch this video from a man named Ivan Mawarire. It's really hard to say. Mawarire, if you want to check it out later. He was a church planter in Zimbabwe. So he planted a church, and in his country of Zimbabwe, there was a lot of corruption in leadership. There was inflation that was absolutely unbelievable. It made currency essentially worthless. You couldn't even buy a piece of bread with literally billions of dollars in their currency. And so essentially things were just an absolute mess. And the poor were being taken advantage of and left behind and forgotten. And eventually it was coming to a breaking point. He, in a moment of just spending time with God, he decided to set up his phone. He leaned it against his Bible, and he recorded a video just calling people to prayer and reminding people what this nation was supposed to be when it was recently set up as an independent nation. He was holding his flag and talking about the symbolism behind the flag and all of these different things. And he was just calling out to the people and calling for accountability. And he threw it on Facebook, just on a whim. And he kind of forgot about it. The next morning he got a phone call, and he found out that his video had over 200,000 views in less than 12 hours. And so what started happening was that this message was going viral. People were starting to look to him. He became sort of a figure in his country. Now again, this was a time of big time corruption. So people who were speaking out were just disappearing and winding up dead. And some people, they had no idea where they ended up going or were arrested, things like that. And but he kept going. He felt that God was calling him to keep going, to seek justice. And eventually what he did was he ended up calling the nation to a standstill, to a boycott for one day. And everybody participated. The streets were empty. Every time that something happened like this, he was shocked that it went as far as it did. But everybody participated, and the nation shut down for a day. And it was at that point the government started coming after him. They showed up at his house. They threatened to arrest his wife when he wasn't there. They showed up at his kids' schools. The teachers hid his kids away so they didn't snatch them up. And eventually they found him, and they arrested him, and they tortured him. And he was in prison, set to go to a court date the next day. People gathered at the courthouse. Thousands of people gathered, to the point where they decided, we were going to release him to put this, to dispel this whole gathering of people who were protesting. And so they released him. Some people from the church found out that their plan was to just quietly rearrest him the next day. And so they escorted him and his family out of the country by 2 different paths, and they ended up in the United States in safety. We pick up the video at that point in the story and hear about Ivan's story from there. Check it out.
I would have liked for the story to end with our escaping Zimbabwe and arriving in safety in the United States. My daughter was born when we arrived here, but a month after she was born, I felt the Lord say to me, you need to go back. You're not done. So I made the decision to go back to Zimbabwe. My family stayed here. They didn't come with me. I was not going to put them through that. I landed in Zimbabwe on the 1st of February 2017, and immediately on my arrival I was arrested. In fact, the security agents took me off the flight. I was handcuffed. They took my bags with me. I was strip searched at the airport, completely naked and searched, and then I was interrogated. And this time I was processed very quickly by the police, and I was sent to Chikorubi Maximum Security Prison, where I was held there for almost 3 months. I was in so much despair because I felt I had either heard God wrong or I felt that He had let me down. I was very angry, either way, at Him or at myself. And the prison guard leads me into this cell, and it's the open courtyard part of it, and he leads me in and he says, okay, this is where you're going to be. You're going to have to figure out which area you're going to sleep in. These 4 guys approach me, and in my mind I'm thinking, that's it. This is where I get beaten. And I mean, when they approached me, they were very, very decisive in their walk. So I lean against the wall and I'm ready for a fight. In terms of whatever was going to happen, I was going to fight back. And the guy says, no, we have been expecting. And I said, really? And he says, yeah, my friends and I here, we are Christian. And when we heard you had come back, because we knew about you even before you left Zimbabwe, we knew what you were doing. But when we heard you came back, my friends and I were praying that you would be brought to this very cell. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And he says, we wanted to make sure that you were well looked after, because you've been doing this work fighting for our families. And so our job is to make sure that for as long as you're going to be in this prison, you are well looked after, and that you are stronger when you leave than when you came in. Man, and I just broke down and cried. I couldn't believe it. God, whom I was so angry at, was right there and then showing me that I will watch over you even in the depths of the worst place that you can imagine. Those 4 men became my pastors. You know, these are guys who were self-confessed criminals. They told me everything they did. But they looked after me. Every time I came back from torture sessions, those 4 guys picked me up and they encouraged me. Every time I came back from solitary confinement, those 4 guys ministered to me, prayed with me, and they would get me in front of the other prisoners and they'd say, hey, dude, you gotta preach. You're not gonna be in this prison for long, so we need you to minister to these guys. We had some of the most amazing worship sessions. I'll never forget it. We sang the one night. Our cell is about 50 men in a small cell. We slept regimented and we worshipped the whole night. The prison guards came to shut us down and we kept singing. And then the next cell picked up the song we were singing, and then the next cell picked up until the whole place was singing. It was like a dream. It's unbelievable. But God showed me that He's true to His word, and that when He says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you, it's not a concept. It's reality. The day my bail came and I had to leave that prison after 3 months, I was heartbroken. We had formed a community with these men that was amazing. We had prayed through stuff. We had exchanged stories. We had talked about the goodness of God. We had talked about hope. We talked about serving sentences and finishing them and looking forward to God. making something out of our lives and taking from the ashes and building beautiful things. I don't know where many of them have gone, but I know for a fact, that many of them have gone on to make something of themselves and to impact their own families and other people, as well. I left that prison, I was out of bail, and I would go on to be arrested 8 more times after that. I ended up with 4 treason charges after that, amounting to 80 years in prison. And yet it was the most purposeful, most productive time of this journey. We'd get beaten every time we got arrested, but it was part of the work, it was part of the process. It made me realize that for everything that we want to see happen, there is a price to be paid. And it's not money, it's not possessions, but it's self. What will you give yourself for? Who will you decide to serve with your life? Because until we are prepared to lose our lives, we're never going to see the gain or the benefit of lives won, of lives restored.